Perfect. So welcome to the fourth and final session of our four-part New Dentist Survival Guide series, Setting Yourself Up for Success. I am Grazia Yeager, the Director of Marketing for the New York State Dental Association, and this is the third year we are offering this webinar series to new dentists across New York State. And we want to thank MILMIC for being our sponsor for this webinar series. MILMIC and New York State Dental Association have worked together since 1992 to provide dentists the best liability protection available at the lowest possible premium consistent with fiscal responsibility. So a little housekeeping, at the end of the program tonight, you must respond to 3 questions to receive your CE credit. We're going to hold all the questions till the end, but please submit your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, and just throughout the webinar. We'll just answer all of them towards the end. Tonight, Reg Harnish is going to talk to us about the state of cybersecurity for dental practices, best practices for managing these challenges, and the trends we expect to see in 2023. Reg is a nationally recognized cybersecurity veteran, investor, board member, advisor, speaker, author, and CEO of Orbital Fire. Orbital Fire is a leading cybersecurity service provider focused on simplifying, automating, and ultimately solving security challenges for the underserved small businesses. Reg has been practicing cybersecurity for nearly 2 years. I'm going to hand this off to you now.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for the warm welcome. It sounds like my mom wrote that. It's pretty good. Well, I hope I don't disappoint and can live up to all of that. Thank you for being here tonight. I know it's late, and I know you guys are here for CPEs. I'm going to try and make this flow and give you something that you can use pretty much immediately. Honestly, cybersecurity has become one of those topics. Doesn't matter whether you're a dental practice or you're manufacturing ball bearings or really selling sweaters online, where managing a practice and managing a business and survivability and viability, it's really become sort of a cost of doing business, no different than the way we think about, oral health and brushing teeth. It's just something you do. What I would also say was similar to brushing teeth is that once you get into it, you start to see some of the benefits, and it's just really not that big of a deal. It takes a little bit of time, maybe a little bit of commitment, but I think with some basics, you can protect your teeth and protect your business in sort of a similar approach anyway. So I know, appreciate the introduction, so I'm actually going to skip this. And what I will say is that healthcare has really been probably the primary market segment or industry that I have been working in cybersecurity really for the better part of about 15 years. So I kind of feel your pain. And then most recently working with smaller organizations over the past 3 years, where I would say your challenges are not necessarily unique, but they are a totally different scale and complexity. And that's really where I specialize now, is helping smaller organizations who may not have resources or budgets or even a general understanding of cybersecurity and best practices. Simplifying all of that has really become an important part, really sort of the core to our mission. And so encourage you, if there are questions throughout the presentation, to throw them in the Q&A. We'll get to every single one tonight, no matter how many there are. So I want to really start off and talk about where we are in cybersecurity. I've been doing this a long time, but I'll say that the last couple of years, I would say 2021 in general, but it hasn't really gotten much better. But 2021 was the year where cybersecurity became a household word, or a business hold word, maybe better way to put it, because it's affected small business owners and decision makers and leaders in a way that it really never had before. And today, particularly in healthcare, it's a challenge now because everyone wants to know that you're building a cybersecurity program, whether it's focused on HIPAA compliance or preventing ransomware and wire fraud. And so whether it's renewing your cyber insurance, whether it's questionnaires from folks in your supply chain, whether it could be, you're perhaps an M&A target and your buyer or an investor is, wants to understand what are you doing to protect EPHI and other sensitive information. It's really become a front and center issue for most, if not all, small businesses. And again, the challenge has really been that, one, there are very few resources for small organizations, and the vast majority of the industry is really focused on enterprise. So whether it's the tools or the providers, there's just very few options if you're on the lower end of that spectrum. So, and in healthcare, obviously specific challenges around whether it's, HIPAA compliance, high tech, or any of the subsequent guidance that's come out from HHS and OCR around what's required of any covered entity as it relates to protecting EPHI. But let's start here. I think it's important that we all recognize that increasingly, regardless of what industry you're in and what size your business is, that the world is becoming just a collection of ones and zeros. And I'm sure everyone has seen The Matrix and knows the concept. But when we talk about this, we suggest that at some point, really, the world will act very much like the movie. And I usually get a few chuckles, but think about it today. Everything you do is really done through manipulating data in computers or networks or in the cloud, the internet, your interactions, your communications, or your entertainment, the way you pay your claims or your providers. All of this is done through ones and zeros, just manipulating. And because everything has become data and data has become ambient, really every company is a data company now. And because risks to data have become more frequent and more severe, you have to think that the risk to your business and the viability of your business has gone up significantly and at the same time. What hasn't really kept pace is our ability to deal with these types of cyber threats. I would argue that most healthcare providers, most dental practices, the ones that we work with certainly, are getting better slowly at cybersecurity, and they are committed to doing that and protecting their patients' privacy and information and compliance, and the list goes on. But what's happening is that our adversaries, the people who are after that data, who can monetize that by, through identity theft or selling it online, their capabilities are increasing faster. So what we see is a widening in the gap between where we need to be and where we are, simply as a result of an ever improving adversary, but then also regulatory change. Auditors can be adversaries at times too, as can be the federal and state governments and all sorts of other sort of disjointed priorities. This all becomes a challenge for cybersecurity because it does require some focus. But I think it's important to recognize that we're just at the beginning of this. And increasingly, whether it's, dental equipment and tools or it's EPHI, your business will become a data business. And that's just kind of the way the world is going. And I mentioned 2021 is sort of a hallmark year, and we've really seen no let up since. But in 2021, there were a number of significant security incidents that were national and global news that really had an impact, a direct impact on everyday consumers. And it became clear at that point that cybercrime is directly affecting the lives of every citizen in this country. And whether it's, you can make an appointment at your dental practice, or what you pay for a steak, or can I get gas for my car? These are things that are directly related to cybercrime. Now, I think we think about what's going on in healthcare specifically, it's really the epicenter of things like identity theft. And if you've been a victim of identity theft, you know that it can be painful, expensive, time-consuming, frustrating, confusing. But increasingly, we're seeing this, and of course, EPHI is at the core of identity theft. It's one of the reasons that a medical record is worth more on the dark market than a credit card, because a credit card can be canceled, but your social security number and your last name, not so easy. So what else is going on? Generally speaking, we don't like to talk about statistics in cybersecurity because I won't say they're not factual, but they're difficult to really track down. And the integrity of these numbers can be very contextual or very one-sided. But one thing is for sure, we do know that things are getting worse and that the losses from cybercrime are stacking up. The percentage of businesses, certainly healthcare and otherwise, that are being affected by cybercrime continues to increase year over year, as is the visibility to things like cybercrime. And keep in mind, we're not just talking about cyber criminals tonight. There are lots of different risks to your practice, and again, whether it's HIPAA compliance or it's an audit or your board asking questions about what you're doing in cybersecurity. All of these things tend to be ultimately risks for your practice. But statistically speaking, it's getting worse, and I think that's really caught the attention of a lot of small business owners. And but what hasn't happened is the industry hasn't really changed in a way that suits or satisfies the needs of smaller healthcare entities. Again, because most of the providers and most of the industry are focused on large industries. So the point here is we don't really know how much worse it's getting or how much faster it's getting worse, but we do know for sure that there are no positive numbers in this industry. We don't see declines in really any sector. It's also more confusing than ever, right? As our environments become more complex, whether you're moving to the cloud or you have a remote workforce or people are working from mobile devices, or the internet continues to expand and we're doing more online with telemedicine, but protecting your practice is more confusing because cybersecurity itself is more confusing. We see a lot of unnecessary complexity, but certainly very little attempt to simplify this so that people can make informed decisions about what's important or where are their greatest risks. The pandemic introduced a whole bunch of problems, or let's say new challenges for small practices, in the sense that, again, they're dealing with a remote workforce. Everyone's distracted by the health and safety of their workforce and their patients. Meanwhile, the people who used to be focused on cybersecurity are now helping people print from home or setting up VPNs or shipping computers to remote employees. But then, of course, in terms of a priority, the pandemic kind of took our eye off the ball a little bit because everyone was hoarding cash and they were worried about stockpiling flu kits and so there were a whole bunch of things that changed during the pandemic that really caused us to pause in cybersecurity and maybe even decline in terms of our ability to progress. We know for sure that things like ransomware are increasing, but even more prevalent than ransomware. While ransomware gets all the headlines, what we're seeing is really probably 3x the number of cases and losses in business email compromise and wire fraud. So basically social engineering, or your CEO sending texts, fraudulent text from your CEO requesting gift cards or changes to a wire transfer, or fraudulent emails from an employee's compromised email account, changing their direct deposit account information. And it just goes on and on. Fake invoices from existing suppliers and providers. We're seeing a massive increase in that type of fraud and loss right now. And actually the FBI will tell you that at least 3x what we're seeing in terms of ransomware cases and losses in simple wire fraud. And it's because our adversaries shift. Our attention was really on ransomware for years, and we probably got a little bit better at that. And so they decided they were going to focus somewhere else. And so that's prevalent right now. We know that third-party pressure is increasing, and this could be anywhere from contractual demands to insurance applications to you name it. Everyone is getting a better sense of what is expected in cybersecurity. And so that's cascading out through supply chains and really into sort of normal why can't I say that? Normal nomenclature for small healthcare entities. And so while where our education and our ability to understand cybersecurity is increasing, that means that everyone's getting a little bit better at it or understanding it. So they're asking questions, and we're seeing this pop up more and more. But then again, a compounding issue for smaller practices is that they're just, if you're committed to doing something in cybersecurity, building a program, understanding your risk, remediating, and protecting your practice, honestly, there's just not a lot of options out there. Whether it's the technology, the providers, the professional services firms, they're all designed for enterprises. And so the tools tend to be very complex, very expensive. They take a long time to implement and armies of people to maintain. Similarly, with professional services and other services firms, they're really designed for sending in armies of people to solve massive, complex cybersecurity issues. So they really can't afford to work with smaller organizations, and you can't afford to work with them either. So on top of having really similar risks and challenges that large enterprises might, there you have far fewer options for addressing those issues. Another issue, the regulatory landscape just continues to migrate and evolve and change, and in some cases radically. So if you take credit cards at your practice, you should know the requirements and regulations for accepting credit card payments changed dramatically last year. And next year, there'll be increasing enforcement, increasing requirements for compliance with PCI, which again, if you're taking credit cards, you're actually subject to. HIPAA is expected to release some updates to both the HIPAA security and privacy rules later this year. I think a lot of it will be privacy, which may be a new practice or newish practice for many folks here. The New York State themselves, they're getting smarter and looking at how they could protect their constituents by enforcing cybersecurity practices across every industry. Certainly healthcare, being in critical infrastructure, is not escaping any of that for sure. But the point is, while the people who want to do you harm are evolving and getting better, the people who actually want to help you are evolving and getting better as well. And so these requirements continue to mature and evolve. But generally what that means is you've got more to do in cybersecurity, whether it's for the good guys or for the bad guys. It doesn't really matter. This is the evolution of the market and the practice, really. Now, the good news is that a lot of cybersecurity is really just basic hygiene, like brushing your teeth. And I mean that seriously. I'm so glad that this popped up, because I love the analogy. And I think the analogy holds true in many ways. So the more often you brush your teeth, the more effectively you brush your teeth, the better tools you use, your mindset around what you put in your mouth is no different, really, very similar to what you put into your business. And so, I encourage you to think about it like that, which in some cases it's preventative. In some cases, you've got a cavity and you've got to deal with that. But we're all looking to avoid those types of problems, whether it's, in our mouth or in our practice. So let me talk a little bit about what we are educating and counseling our dental practice customers on. And we've got quite a few of them, actually. And again, we try to simplify this for them in a way that they can understand so they can make informed decisions. The first is this. If you are moving towards building a cybersecurity program and investing in cybersecurity, no matter what state of development you're in or what decisions you're making, whether it's buying a tool, engaging a provider like Orbital Fire, it could be anything, make sure that you're focused on two goals. One, the first is defensibility. The reality is that no one is compliant. And I've been doing cybersecurity for the better part of 15 years. I've never seen a compliant organization, or certainly if they're compliant today, doesn't mean they're compliant tomorrow. And so what's happened is that all of these regulatory authorities, including HHS, OCR, Joint Commissions, or anyone that you're working with, have kind of settled on a few different things. But one is the practice in a defensible position? Meaning, if a third party asks you what you're doing in cybersecurity and you tell them, well, that third party better say, that seems reasonable, that seems appropriate, that seems adequate. We will work with you, or we'll buy your product, or we won't penalize you, or you won't be subject to sort of a punitive audit. It could be a lot of different things. Defensibility is really about doing enough of the right things in the right order so that your program is appropriate. Now, not everyone is dental Aspen Dental, and not everyone is Aspen Dental. And so the good news here is that for smaller practices, you have less surface area, you have fewer assets, you have less complexity, you have fewer people. And so defensibility and that appropriateness means we can start to adjust your program so that you're not necessarily required to go to the same lengths that a large, organization or enterprise might be. But you cannot escape defensibility. So in some ways, this is more important than the next one, because perception can often be reality. And if you can't tell a good story about your cybersecurity program, well, that may result in reputational damage or loss of business, regulatory penalties. It could be a lot of different things. And so really focus on, what story can I tell about my cybersecurity program? And how do I explain that its appropriateness, that it's reasonable and adequate for my practice? And the second is something that's more focused on sort of daily operations, and resilience in your business has become really one of the #1 goals for cybersecurity in any industry, any size, because we know that you probably don't care about cybersecurity, but you don't want problems with cybersecurity, right? So no different than most of us and our teeth, where we really don't think about it on a daily basis until we need a root canal, or until, one gets knocked out. Then it's like, oh my God, my teeth, it's a big deal. But in the case of resilience, what we want to build into your business is enough of those cybersecurity protections to help you minimize, one, the number of cavities that you get, but two, the size and severity of those cavities and how expensive it is to fill those or to recover from them. Incidents occur in many different ways. Obviously, we talk a lot about ransomware and wire fraud because those, for smaller organizations, those are the killers. But a lot of different things can happen. And for us, it's not necessarily about inventorying every single possible thing that could happen, but rather, no matter what happens, we want to be able to get back to doing business normally with the minimum loss, minimum disruption, and minimum negative impact. Again, whether it's reputational or financial, could be anything. So focus on defensibility and resilience. And as you're, exploring your options in cybersecurity, as you're investing, think about and ask yourself the question, do these things contribute to either and or my defensibility or resilience? That's really critically important. That's almost the simplest way we can describe cybersecurity to you is, managing risk to your data to build defensibility and resilience. So keep those, really be laser focused on those two goals. A lot of people ask us, well, okay, those are great for goals. That makes sense. But where should I start and what should I do? So there's 3 things that you should consider. And here they are. You got a Venn diagram. So what you should do is based on a risk assessment. You've all heard of our HIPAA risk assessment. And if done well, a risk assessment can give you a prioritized list of your top risks and the potential impact of not addressing those risks. In addition, it will tell you the severity of the risk. And so not only is it a prioritized order, but also you can see the severity or the scope of this risk. So how critical is it and how big is this risk? Now, a good risk assessment is like gold. However, the disadvantage of doing a risk assessment or doing what you should do is that those are very hard to do them well. You typically need a professional who can come in, understand your assets, understand your supply chain, understand your threats and vulnerabilities, understand risk and help explain that to you. So what you should do can give you great information, but it's very difficult to figure out. The next is what you must do. This is easy because it comes from the HIPAA security rule in other places, like contractual requirements, your cyber insurance application. So the things that you must do is really focused on compliance. Now, the advantage of this approach is that compliance is an often scrutinized status for you, and compliance can go a long way. The problem with it is that compliance only deals with defensibility. It honestly doesn't deal with resilience much at all. Not to say that there aren't some good practices in the HIPAA security rule, but being compliant does not mean that you'll be resilient. They are two completely different things. There is some overlap, of course. So what you must do, easy, and makes some progress on the defensibility side, but does not really necessarily help with resilience. Now, the last one is what you can do. Now, this is what we call a capability approach, meaning I don't know how to do a risk assessment and I don't understand my compliance requirements, but I do have a firewall because I've heard of that. And I have deployed, antivirus, and my EPHI is encrypted because I heard I could do that, or I needed to do that. And so when we think about what you can do, it's all the things that you're familiar with, or you feel like as a practice, you can implement because you understand them, or you can afford them, or it's what you've been doing for years. And so it's familiar. Now, the advantage of what you can do is obvious. It's what you can do. You understand these things. It's close to home. The disadvantage is that doing only what you think you can do may not contribute to either defensibility or resilience. Now, the sweet spot is somewhere here, right in the center. So again, we Venn diagrammed this out. As you're building your program and pursuing both defensibility and resilience, if you think about how do I assess risk at a certain level while mapping that onto and trying to get that to overlap with my compliance and contractual requirements or legal requirements, with overlapping with things that I feel like I understand or I've heard of or I have some familiarity with. That's really the sweet spot, because a big part of cybersecurity is just kind of taking that first step. Once you have a sense of these three different areas, it's not all that difficult to develop what we call a cybersecurity roadmap, which is what am I doing over the next 6, 9, 12 months in cyber to improve my defensibility and resilience. Oftentimes, the devil's in the details, though. I understand that. And so you may not even know necessarily what you can do or understand your compliance requirements, and maybe you don't feel qualified to conduct an effective HIPAA risk assessment. We understand that. There are some resources out there, but again, one of the challenges is, particularly for smaller, practices, is there's just not a lot of great options. Luckily, the golden rule is right here. Whether you're building your own program or you're looking at bringing in a provider or a vendor, if they're not helping you do the absolute minimum, you should keep looking. Because if you're doing effective risk management and you're sort of compiling that with the business objective, which is, of course, treat your patients well and make some money. Let's face it, that's really why you're in business. If you put those things together and you're doing both well, you should be doing the absolute minimum in cybersecurity that is necessary. And I say necessary, really necessary to protect the mission of the business, right? To protect your mission of, helping, patients. But generally speaking, you're probably not doing the minimum. You're probably doing less than that. But you don't need to be, Fort Knox. This is not about implementing all 1,000 things or more that you can do in cybersecurity. This is about figuring out where are your risks to your data and your business, and addressing those in a manner that is appropriate and reasonable, focused on defensibility and resilience, but still the absolute minimum that you can get away with that still helps you protect your mission and protect your business. May sound weird coming from someone who sells cybersecurity services, but this is what you should be shooting for. no more and no less. Unfortunately, the practices that we have worked with or that came to us, we're doing less. And that, of course, is a risk. So what is the absolute minimum, you ask? Well, I've got the answer. There's really three things here. The first is you need some kind of compliance management function. And you may not be doing HIPAA risk assessments every year. You may not understand all the technical and physical administrative controls. You may, not know where to find clarification on the safeguards. You may not have anything more than a spreadsheet to track all of this. We get all of it. But you need to have some kind of compliance function, because if there were ever any third-party scrutiny, or worse yet, if you were to experience some kind of incident and someone were to ask you, well, what were you doing to protect your patient's information? And you say, well, we don't know, or we weren't doing anything. That's really sort of the worst place to possibly be. So start to build a basic compliance function. And whether you outsource that or you do it yourself, doesn't necessarily matter. This is really about establishing where are you in your compliance journey and where are you going. Really important. And if you're not doing this, difficult to avoid that negligence label for sure. This is pretty well understood, pretty well known. And the HIPAA security rule has been around for 15 years. So it's tough to say, well, I just heard about this. The next is something that is often overlooked, which is workforce security. You may have heard this saying that people are your greatest risk in cybersecurity. And while that's not necessarily true the way the industry wants you to believe, it generally is true in the sense that all risk does come down to a human being. So critically important that you are educating your workforce on not just the kinds of risks that you face as a practice, as a healthcare provider, as an organization that lives and feeds off of VPHI. It's also about how do we report incidents? How do we create awareness? I would argue most people that I run into have the skills to detect a phishing scam or an email scam. But what they refuse to do is take the 2.6 seconds it requires to assess that email. But really important. And again, in terms of the absolute minimum, you cannot get away to these days without training and testing your people on cybersecurity. It's just mandatory. Every single questionnaire you face, every single insurance application, every best practice, everything, including HIPAA compliance, mandates that this be done on a regular routine basis, and that you be able to show some improvement in those behaviors. Let me throw three up here. The third is building an incident response capability. And it may be as simple as a call tree for real small practices, or it may be much more complex. It's something that may involve crisis communications and communicating with the FBI, or let's say a managed IT provider who can come in and help recover some of your physical assets. But you need an incident response plan. It may be 1 page, it may be 50 pages, but you need some sort of plan for if and when you experience ransomware or money missing from an account or wire fraud or litigation from a supplier who says they paid a fake invoice that you sent them when really you didn't. Could be anything. Understanding your legal implications, how you and who you need to report to, disclosures, communicating, handling, doing damage control, obviously the IT aspects of it, maybe the FBI should be involved. It can be very complex, but you need to start somewhere building out that plan. And then the fourth is a good cyber insurance policy, because the reality is no matter what you do in cybersecurity, you cannot eliminate all risk. It's not functionally or economically feasible to do so. So find a good broker or a good partner who can get you a good broker, and make sure you understand what your coverages are. We're doing a whole series of webinars on cyber insurance and how it overlaps with cybersecurity. It's a lot to know. It's complex, and that industry is changing a lot. They're becoming much more specific about their requirements, and they're also becoming much more elusive in terms of who is a good risk and who will even get a policy. but also if you experience an incident and you go to claim on that policy, essentially you're going to have to prove right then that everything you said you were doing in the application, that all of those things were working during that incident, or you're not going to get paid on a claim either. This is really what we think of as the absolute minimum. So ask yourself, can I defensively say that I'm doing these things? And if not, you should probably consider either building something yourself or engaging someone that can help you. There are other things, of course. What should you do next after the absolute minimum? A qualified HIPAA risk assessment that's based on an established standard, meaning there's lots of people doing assessments out there. It does not necessarily mean that it's going to qualify as a HIPAA risk assessment. The HHS and OCR have been very specific about exactly, here are the 9 steps that you need to take for this to be a qualified assessment. Now, the good news is that all of that is open source and anyone can learn how to do a HIPAA risk assessment. The bad news is that it generally takes a long time to be really good at that. And so you have to ask your question, what makes the most sense? You should be doing this on a regular basis. Typically annual is what auditors and regulators have settled on. If you're not doing it annually, you should probably have a good reason for that, some justification. Remediation. So it's one thing to do a great HIPAA risk assessment, but if you ignore it and don't do anything, it's kind of like you didn't do the assessment at all, or maybe worse, because now you have qualitative or quantitative data in front of you and you've neglected it. So once you do that risk assessment, you need to put together a cybersecurity roadmap, a plan for remediating those top risks. And that's obviously important because there's accountability for the program throughout healthcare and certainly throughout your practice. You're going to be held accountable for not just doing the assessment, but doing something with the results and the findings. Again, a risk assessment done well will give you a prioritized list. And so you're not going to have to guess. It'll also help you understand, well, how much of this thing should I do? And so, again, really lean on that risk assessment to provide you good direction. Now, the last is a concept that, as I mentioned earlier, very few, if any, healthcare entities, dental practices included, are 100% compliant all the time. It's just, that's not realistic. Everything changes, right? Your business changes. You acquire a competitor, or you open a new location, or turn up a new application, or move to the cloud, or the regulatory requirements change. Everything's constantly in flux. So compliance is not really a destination. It's something that you do continuously. The risk assessment can help you do that, but part of this is showing that you're committed to protecting those assets, EPHI and other patient information, where continuous improvement is really a critical part of your story and a critical part of your defensibility if you're telling that story. Throw all these up here. There's 5 different domains or areas to a good HIPAA risk assessment. And there's 30 or 40 different safeguards. And again, as I've said before, anyone can really figure out how to do a HIPAA risk assessment, but it may not be chronologically or economically feasible for you to do that. Most of our dental practice customers are overwhelmed. They barely have time to take a call from us, let alone conduct a risk assessment. So really, that's a very personal decision and one that's important to get answered in terms of a direction. We have also seen dental practices do their own self-assessment for 2 years and then bring in an independent provider to assess every 3rd year. And you can certainly do that as well. Again, if you can tell a good story, then you're in a defensible position. And again, all you need to do is justify the appropriateness and reasonableness of your program. And I won't say you're out of the woods, but you're in a much better position than if you hadn't really sort of handled those, minimum requirements and some of the other things. Okay. I want to leave at least 5 minutes for questions. So I've got a couple of final thoughts here. But again, the more I think about the analogy between brushing teeth and cybersecurity, the more they're identical. these things are truly identical. You have an asset that is worth protecting, and in some cases is actually required. So no different than what you're preaching to your patients about in terms of protecting their, oral health and just basic hygiene that handles most of this stuff. I think we love healthcare because honestly, cybersecurity is much more like personal fitness and taking care of yourself than it is technology or anything else. Okay, but a couple of final thoughts. The first is this: you should have an inventory of your EPHI assets. My guess is many of you are partially or significantly or completely in the cloud, and what you're using for a patient, information system or an EMR, EHR, if you're using a cloud-based software as a service application, that's one example of an inventory. You might have spreadsheets. You might have contact information. EPHI is going to live all over your practice. What's important is, and where you want to start, is identifying even a basic spreadsheet with a couple of rows and columns in it can help you start really identifying the scope of your compliance requirements and really the scope of things that you need to protect. Because other than things like your banking credentials or access to your network, EPHI is kind of the number one thing. Bank accounts are up there as well, but you can really sort of narrow in on what's important. Take a spreadsheet. This is something you could probably do in a half an hour today, tomorrow, whenever, and list out all of the places in your practice where EPHI can be created, stored, processed, or transmitted. And then of that list, you need to start thinking about, well, what controls do I have in place to protect the confidentiality or the integrity of that data, right? Again, starting to mature your program. And again, going back to that inventory, if someone asked me what I was doing to protect these things, these assets, am I doing enough? Do I feel comfortable explaining in a defensible way what our cybersecurity program looks like? Number two, if you are sitting there thinking that your IT guy has got this, your IT guy don't got this. Cybersecurity and IT rarely overlap. There's a very common and deeply problematic misperception about cybersecurity. It is not technology. In fact, at least 2/3, if not 80% of the HIPAA security rule has nothing to do with technology. Cybersecurity is an animal all on its own. So if your IT provider comes and tells you that they're a cybersecurity provider, that may be true, but what they're telling you is that they can sell you a firewall or antivirus, or maybe encryption, or maybe something more advanced like multi-factor authentication. These are all technologies. But even all of those things added up don't really even scratch the surface of what's required in the HIPAA security rule and other best practices and regulatory mandates. So the challenge for you will be, are you going to become a cybersecurity expert, or are you going to find one, but don't count on your IT provider to do cybersecurity for you? No matter, most IT providers are good people. This is not to demonize them, but they may not understand cybersecurity themselves. And so make sure you're asking questions of your IT provider in terms of, well, what exactly are you doing in the cybersecurity realm? And there may be some things, but generally speaking, at least 2/3 of your cybersecurity program will not be technology. It will be other things like process and training and governance and policy and all sorts of other things. Make someone accountable. So you don't necessarily need a chief information security officer, but you should have someone at your practice. And typically, if I'm thinking about all of our dental customers, usually it's the practice manager that is responsible for your cybersecurity program, your HIPAA compliance program. They do not need to be experts in HIPAA or cybersecurity, but simply responsible and accountable for making sure that the program is in a defensible, resilient place. And, it's like anything else, until you put someone's name on it, it may not get done, right? Once someone is responsible for it, it shows up in their job description and maybe their performance reviews, then you'll start to see more progress when someone's name is attached to it. But naming, putting accountability on this is really, really critically important. I mentioned earlier this concept of continuous improvement, but it cannot be overstated, the importance of this. We have many healthcare and dental customers who start out at 20%, 35% compliant. And we say, great, at least we know where we are. And now we can start to build towards 46% next year and 58% the following year, and then 65% or whatever it is. Again, being able to tell that story of continuous improvement, year over year, time after time, is really a powerful, powerful statement, because defensibility is not just about what you've committed to and what you've been able to do and achieve and accomplish, but also part of it's environmental. So when any federal, state, regulatory agency or authority comes to you and says, hey, why aren't you doing X in cybersecurity? You say, well, we wanted to. We actually put some money aside, we put some resources aside. We simply couldn't find anything. It's tough for them to argue with that. And so keep in mind that your defensibility story has a lot of facets to it, but none more important than your ability to show continuous improvement year over year. We often get the question, it was probably already in the chat here, how much should I spend on cybersecurity? And that's a very difficult question to answer, but I'm going to give you a simple solution. But first, one thing is, it should not be part of your IT budget, because cybersecurity is about managing risk. It's not about email. It's not about storage or Microsoft licenses. It's not about the cloud. In fact, cybersecurity is agnostic to all of those things. It doesn't care what kind of computers you have, whether you're in Google or Microsoft, whether you're in the cloud or on premises, whether, which EMR or AHR are using, it doesn't care at all about any of that stuff. What it cares about is how well you've done managing risk to EPHI and other sensitive data. So ask yourself, as you're going through and thinking about cybersecurity, answer two questions. One, have I done enough? Meaning, do you feel like if you had a conversation with a third party, anyone, whether it's a board member or patient, it could be anyone, have I done enough? And if I tell this story, am I in a defensible position? But perhaps even more important is the question, is it worth it? As you're evaluating whether it's tools and technologies or a cloud provider, ask yourself, is the investment in this cybersecurity technology or tool or service or provider, is it worth it? Is it going to produce returns for my practice? And if you can, in a accurate way, say no, and you should keep looking. But if you can say yes, then maybe that's a place to start, is to really think about, because everything we do is about return on investment. So there's not really a percentage of your overall revenue, income, profit that you should be dedicating to cyber, but you'll know whatever that percentage is, whether it's 2% or it's 20%, you'll have a feeling, am I doing enough? Do I feel like I'm in a defensible position? Will I wish I have spent more if we're hit with ransomware, or if we're hit with a lawsuit because, we've had a bunch of EPHI exposed to the internet? Those are the two basic questions, right? Have I done enough? Is it worth it? Last, I want to just kind of discount everything I just said, in the sense that if there's an incident and you, regardless of where you are in building your HIPAA security or HIPAA compliance or cybersecurity program, incidents really tend to change things. And so it's great to have a plan, to have a budget, to name someone. But if you experience some kind of incident with EPHI or ransomware or something like that, it will probably change you as a practice. And that's kind of the story that we see repeatedly throughout, every small business industry, is that one of the big differences between enterprises and small healthcare practices or, covered entities, is that they just don't have the resources to recover from. Now, I think the industry would have you believe that 60% of all small businesses who are hit with ransomware go out of business. That's simply not true, or there wouldn't be any small businesses. But we do know that it can be very impactful, very disruptive, very expensive. And so as you're thinking about, what your priority is in terms of compliance or meeting contractual demands, legal requirements, keep in mind that the moment that you experience ransomware or business email compromise or wire fraud, it's probably going to be a bad day. And as you're building the program, try to think ahead for, what do I wish I would have done in this case? Or do I feel like I should have spent more to help avoid this or to help, build resilience? It'll give you a little bit of context, because answering the question about what do I do, how much do I do in cyber, can be a difficult one, particularly if you're just starting out. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. We have exactly 6 minutes left for questions. So I will turn it back to Grazia and we will answer any and all of your questions.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions right now, but I thought that presentation was really great. I think it's got a jam-packed with information, and I know that we're going to be sending a follow-up email, and we've created a bit of a tip sheet that kind of reviews these couple of topic key items that you've discussed. So definitely be looking for that in your email. Feel free to throw something in the Q&A if you have something. I will launch the poll in a minute, and so everyone can take their surveys for the CE, but if something comes to mind while I'm launching this, then feel free to ask that question. But I just found it really interesting. And I think, a lot of our doctors are not so much on the ransomware side. They're getting phone calls from folks that are saying they're part of the Department of Education looking for licensure information because their license is about to expire, and they're about to share a whole lot of private information to renew their license. And we're reminding our doctors, like, just be careful, things are getting savvier, and you're just not maybe thinking about that email doesn't seem fraudulent, it seems really important, and sometimes you may just want to take a minute and verify with the agency, with the association, and see if that's a valid kind of request that's going out right now. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to launch this while we give people a few minutes. So I'm going to leave that up over here and keep an eye on the Q&As and see if anyone pops one in. But I think it was really interesting. I always find it fascinating, cybersecurity stuff.
It's a little James Bondy, I think the movies do a great job of convincing folks that, it's all like high tech, nerdy kids with hoodies. It's nothing like that, of course, but there tends to be a lot of fascination with what we're doing.
Well, because it's very mysterious feeling, even though it's
right.
so out there, so important to protect, like you said, the assets of your business, to make sure that it doesn't get compromised at all, or, with someone trying to do something that just seems an innocent email. Those are the most common. An employee, I know that we've done our cybersecurity at the association testing to see if someone can, clicks on a link they shouldn't click on to go back through cybersecurity training again.
Yeah, that's a big problem. And I think, with, what's going on with artificial intelligence today, it's getting harder and harder to distinguish the truth, the real thing from something that's fraudulent. And whether it's an email or an entire website or an invoice, it could be.
It's just like a spelling error is the thing
really
that keeps you
anything,
off.
yeah.
But you're just like, wait, this looks really real, and it just takes a minute to kind of, is this real? Like, did I buy something? Why am I getting an invoice?
Yes, exactly.
So, all right, well, I'm going to stop recording this, and if anything does come up and questions come up afterwards and they reach out to me, I will be sure to forward them to you, Reg. I think this was great, but
awesome.
See if we have any more questions.
Well, thank you everyone for your time tonight. Again, I know it's late. Appreciate it. If there are any questions, please, I think Grazia will have my contact information and would be happy to clarify or provide more information if it's necessary.
Absolutely. I will absolutely do that. Well, thank you again and have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.